The United States was the first country on the planet to purchase an aircraft for military applications with the 1909 Wright military flyer, and ever since, America has consistently invested heavily into innovating its approach to air power. From the world's first plane-mounted gun to the world's first stealth bomber, Uncle Sam has always been willing to invest in the competitive advantage that cutting-edge aviation technology can deliver. But the first victory a game-changing jet like the F-22 Raptor or B-2 Spirit has to secure is not in combat. Rather, it's in the secretive confines of experimentation and industry competition, as these jets fly for their lives against the most advanced and capable opponents American industry has to offer. Once a victor is chosen, the losers often fall away into obscurity, with the lucky ones finding a home in aviation museums and the less fortunate occupying space in the dustiest corners of old hangars, or worse, wasting away in the sun of America's aviation boneyards. And then there are other exotic aircraft designs that deliver incredible new capabilities that just don't fill a pressing need at the moment, or that simply cost too much to be practical. These unusual and forward-leaning jets often find a similar fate, destined to do little more than collect dust and serve as a reminder of what could have been. In this Iceberg, we'll cover 40 of these secretive prototypes and concepts that came close to making it into production, but ultimately fell short of securing a contract. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is an Air Power Iceberg. So you might be asking, what is an iceberg chart? Well, iceberg charts really blew up in popularity back in 2020 and 2021 thanks to a rash of Reddit posts and YouTube videos leveraging the model for everything from cryptids to economic systems. The premise is based on a long-standing academic metaphor that likens the understanding of a complex topic to an iceberg, with the most commonly understood bits of information making up the visible part of that iceberg above the surface of the water, and the larger breadth of lesser-known facts making up the body of the iceberg beneath the surface. In common use in places like Reddit and YouTube, the deeper below the surface you go, into the darker, murkier depths, the more uncommon, secretive, or unusual the information. And often, icebergs are split into several levels for the sake of organization. Now, if you find that you really like this model of presenting information, there is an entire subreddit devoted to iceberg charts that you can visit, and I'll include a link to the description below. But let's dive right into this aviation what-if iceberg at level 6, which we'll call flying high, maybe the most commonly known aircraft on the list, and we will begin with a fan favorite, the YF-23. The YF-23 was Northrop Grumman's entry into the Advanced Tactical Fighter competition, and it ultimately lost out to Lockheed Martin's YF-22, which would go on to become the F-22 Raptor. Now, 2 YF-23 prototypes were built. The first, dubbed the Black Widow 2 by those involved with the program, was all black and powered by a pair of Pratt & Whitney engines that allowed the jet to supercruise at Mach 1.43 during its first round of testing in 1990. The second YF-23, painted gray and dubbed the Gray Ghost, switched to General Electric YF-120 engines, which offered even better supercruising capabilities, reaching Mach 1.6 in testing, just slipping past the YF-22's Mach 1.58. Ultimately, while the YF-23 could just about match the F-22's aerobatics, Lockheed won the perception war by demonstrating their fighters' capabilities in a more dynamic way. Lockheed test pilots showed off the aircraft's ability to utilize a high angle of attack, fired missiles, and executed maneuvers that placed more than 9 G's worth of force on the airframe. And while the YF-23 could have done really most of that stuff, Northrop didn't in their demonstration. So many contend that it was this salesmanship, rather than strictly the platform's capabilities, that helped the YF-22 stand out in the minds of defense officials. Up next is the XB-70. Now, in the late 1950s, the North American XB-70 Valkyrie looked like it had been ripped straight out of the pages of a science fiction comic book. With a sharp, angular design, 6 afterburning engines, and the latest targeting, navigation, and electronic warfare systems America had to offer, the XB-70 was to become the world's biggest, fastest, and highest flying bomber in history. Right until it wasn't. Today, the Valkyrie serves not just as a reminder, but arguably as the very pinnacle of the Cold War aviation philosophy of circumventing enemy defenses through even higher and faster flying platforms. The XB-70, like America's famed SR-71 Blackbird and its defunct interceptor sister, the YF-12, aimed to deliver both in classic American style by just burning through budgets like jet fuel, and that did not ultimately pan out. Up next is the F-22B. Back before the first Raptor took flight, the Air Force was not looking for only a single-seat fighter. In fact, the prototype order that the Air Force gave Lockheed Martin called for 7 single-seat iterations of the aircraft for testing, dubbed F-22As, and 2 twin-seat F-22Bs. From pilot training to distributing the cognitive load of elaborate and advanced combat operations, there are lots of reasons for building a fighter with room for a second seat. Like the F-14 Tomcat, the F-15E Strike Eagle, and many other twin-seat fighters, including the new twin-seat J-20 that China has fielded, the rear operator can track enemy targets and friendly aircraft, increase situational awareness, operate electronic warfare suites and countermeasures, and just generally allow the pilot to focus on flying. The twin-seat F-22B never made it into production, but if it had, it may have made the air superiority fighter an even more promising option as a medium-range bomber, or made it better suited for the attack role that fighters on board carriers often have to fill, both roles that F-22 variants were later considered for. There's really just a whole lot of maybes balled up in that second ejection seat that never found its way into the Raptor. Up next is the X-32. The X-32 was Boeing's entry into the Joint Strike Fighter competition that ultimately produced Lockheed Martin's F-35. Boeing's X-32 design aimed to minimize both production and maintenance costs by leveraging a large one-piece carbon fiber composite delta wing and as many shared systems between variants as possible. Its large chin-mounted air intake was the result of Boeing's decision to use a direct lift thrust vectoring system to support short takeoff and vertical landing, or STOVL operations. Now, this allowed the X-32 to conduct STOVL operations using just one engine. By comparison, the F-35B also uses just one engine, but also a lifting fan that's powered by that engine via a driveshaft. Ultimately, of course, the F-35 beat out the X-32, maybe in part because the X-32 just looked a bit derpy. And up next, we have the VZ-9 Avrocar. Now, the Avrocar was quite literally intended to be a real-life flying saucer. First designed for the Canadian military and then purchased by the United States for further testing, the VZ-9 was meant to answer looming concerns about airstrips being wiped out in the early days of a large-scale conflict. Rather than needing runways to take off and land, the VZ-9 would do so vertically. Now, in order to achieve this vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL capability, Avrocar's John Jack Frost aimed to use the exhaust from the turbojet engines to drive a circular turbo rotor to produce a cushion of thrust beneath the circular aircraft. Now, this would allow the Avrocar to hover at low altitudes. The thrust from the engines could then be redirected backward, pushing the aircraft forward and according to their design, allowing it to operate like a highly capable fighter, at least again, according to their design claims. Ultimately, the VZ-9 just never quite lived up to its lofty expectations, and because it couldn't, it ultimately fell away to history. Up next is the B-1A. Today's B-1B Lancer is America's only supersonic heavy payload bomber, with variable sweep wing geometry reminiscent of Cold War fighters like the F-14 Tomcat, and with a top speed of Mach 1.2. But its direct predecessor offered even more power, with an intended top speed above Mach 2. The B-1A was ultimately canceled by the Carter administration, citing increasingly capable standoff missiles and ICBMs as a more cost-effective nuclear deterrent. But the program was brought back during the Reagan administration. But by then, new Soviet surface-to-air missiles had come online that resulted in shifting priorities for the aircraft. And as a result of that, we got the B-1B with a lower top speed but higher maximum payload. Alright, now let's move on to the next level of the iceberg, level 5, at the surface. And we'll start with the F-15 Global Strike Eagle. In 2006, a team from Boeing proposed an incredible new use for America's legendary Eagle that called for mounting a 45-foot rocket to its back. Now, this rocket-carrying fighter would be given the seemingly logical but entirely dramatic moniker of Global Strike Eagle, and it could have revolutionized how America deployed hypersonic weapons or put small payloads into orbit. The idea was to use the Eagle's powerful afterburning turbofan engines and the incredible amount of lift offered by its design to ferry rockets up to high speeds and altitudes before releasing them to ignite and fly the remainder of the journey into orbit. Launching orbital payloads from an aircraft would eliminate the need for expensive rocket launch facilities, while making it possible for F-15s to rapidly deploy payloads into orbit from anywhere on the globe with an airstrip and a hangar. But despite the promise of this concept, it never got off the ground. Up next is another F-15, the F-15 Silent Eagle. Back in 2009, Boeing's Silent Eagle aimed to make the world's most prolific air superiority fighter into something more by injecting stealth into the F-15's legendary DNA. The result may have been the most broadly capable F-15 the world had ever seen, delivered just in time to compete with what would become a foreign sales powerhouse in the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Now, the F-15 Silent Eagle aimed to bridge the gap between 4th and 5th generation fighters, incorporating elements of the stealth and situational awareness offered by the world's most advanced tactical jets into an already legendary fighter airframe. With 58,000 pounds of thrust on tap, internal weapons carriage capabilities, a reduced radar signature, advanced avionics, and the Strike Eagle's multi-role pedigree, this fighter may have been the most capable 4th-gen platform on the planet by the time it would have rolled onto the flight lines of prospective buyers hailing from Canada to Japan and everywhere in between. But ultimately, even a stealthy F-15 wasn't that stealthy, and this program also didn't get off the ground. Now, another F-15, the F-15N. The F-14 Tomcat may have been a legendary fighter that got the Hollywood treatment in 1986's Top Gun, but for a short time in the 1970s, the Navy actually considered tossing the Tomcat in favor of flying the Eagle from its aircraft carriers instead. Now, the F-15 originally was not designed to serve aboard carriers, but it was designed to dominate the skies during the Cold War. With the Navy set to begin purchases of Grumman's pricey F-14, McDonnell Douglas entered a proposal for the F-15N Sea Eagle, which, to be honest, is just way too close to Seagull for my liking. But the proposal wasn't a bad shot. The F-15A already had a tailhook intended for use on short airstrips or in an emergency, but a carrier fighter needs to rely on its hook for every landing, so a larger reinforced hook was added to the Sea Eagle's design. To make for easier storage below deck on carriers, the wings would have folded up at a 90-degree angle, a bit more than 15 feet from each tip. Then the landing gear would have to be swapped out with a more rugged set that could withstand the abuse of regular carrier landings on a rocking ship. Now, McDonnell Douglas said they designed the new gear if the Navy wanted to move forward with the aircraft, and with these changes incorporated, the F-15 only really gained about 3,000 pounds, which, combined with better maneuverability and a higher top speed and a much lower price tag, all made the Seagull sound like a pretty good deal compared to the Tomcat. But there was one very glaring shortcoming. As capable as the F-15N may have been, it couldn't carry as many of America's latest and greatest air-to-air missiles, the AIM-54 Phoenix, and that was just too big a problem for the Navy to ignore. Up next is the F-16XL. For more than 40 years, the F-16 Fighting Falcon has served as the backbone of the U.S. Air Force's fighter fleet. But 1 year before the first F-16 officially entered service, the team behind its development had already developed an even better F-16, and the F-16XL. The fighter was so capable, in fact, that it went from being nothing more than a technology demonstrator to serving as legitimate competition for the venerable F-15E Strike Eagle and the Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter program. Ultimately, it would lose out to the F-15E based on production cost and redundancy of systems, but many still contend that the F-16XL may have been the better platform. Its new wing design, which saw a 50-degree angle near the root of the wing for supersonic performance and a 70-degree angle where the wings extended for subsonic handling, offered more than double the surface area of the original F-16's wings. And those massive wings gave the F-16XL a nearly doubled fuel capacity and the additional lift, coupled with 660 square feet of underwing space, allowing for the addition of an astonishing 27 hardpoints for ordnance. Remarkably, the F-16XL seemed to outperform the F-16A in almost every way, prompting the Air Force to take an interest in the idea of, actually building this new fighter that wasn't originally even meant for production. But again, the Strike Eagle was anything but a bad choice. And this is one of those situations where, when picking between two good choices, there are no wrong answers. Up next is the FB-22, not the F-22B. Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor remains the most potent air superiority fighter in the sky today, and its immense success prompted some within America's defense apparatus to call for an even bigger version of the stealth fighter to serve as a highly survivable medium-range fighter bomber. Now, this effort, dubbed the FB-22, reportedly gained the favor of Air Force Secretary James Roche, among others, before ultimately being discarded for other bomber options along the way. In fact, discussion about the FB-22 may have even helped get the B-21 Raider off the drawing board and into active development earlier than it otherwise may have been. The FB-22 stealth bomber would have shared a number of components with its fighter counterpart, but it would have added a delta wing similar to the F-16XLs that offered a big increase in onboard fuel storage and range and payload, as well as a second crew member, sort of like the F-22B. Though all of that would have come at the cost of some of the legendary platform's aerobatic performance. Now, the goal was to meet the Air Force's growing need for a regional or medium-range bomber that could bridge the capability gap between fighter air-to-ground or attack operations and long-range strategic bombers with heavy payload capabilities. And if it had been put into production, the FB-22 could have been the stealthiest fighter bomber on the planet and the only supersonic stealth bomber ever to reach operational service for any nation to date. But it might be more appropriate to think of the FB-22 as a stealthy replacement for the Strike Eagle instead. And despite initial plans for the Air Force to purchase this aircraft, it ultimately died out alongside the F-22 Raptor's production being curtailed in 2011. Up next is the Vought 1600. Now, the Vought 1600 was an effort to put the Air Force's broadly capable F-16 Fighting Falcon onto America's aircraft carriers. In order to meet the needs of the Navy, the Vought 1600 was larger than the F-16A, stretching some 3 feet longer with a 30-foot 3-inch wingspan that was a full 2 feet broader than the Air Force's version of the fighter. The breadth of the wings also grew, covering a total area of 269 feet and giving the aircraft better stability at lower speeds for carrier landings. The fuselage was flattened a bit and made broader, and its canopy was designed to pivot forward. And that configuration was different from the F-16's, but you can now find it in the F-35. To withstand carrier landings, heavier-duty landing gear had to be affixed to the Vought 1600's belly, alongside the standard carrier equipment like a tailhook. And to offer the engagement range the Navy needed, a new pulse Doppler radar for beyond visual range targeting was also added. All told, the structural changes needed to make the F-16 into the Vought 1600 added more than 3,000 pounds to what is already a very small aircraft, especially as compared to jets like the F-15. Further changes kept coming to the fuselage and wings as subsequent iterations of the Vought 1600 were explored. The V-1602, for instance, had even more wing area at 399 square feet and was given a heavier GE F-101 turbofan engine, but it still wasn't enough to get this aircraft into production. And now let's go even deeper, to level 4 of the iceberg, just beneath the surface. And we'll start with another carrier version of an Air Force fighter, the NATF-22. As the F-22 program matured, it impressed a lot of people, including members of Congress, who pressed the Navy to consider adopting a swing-wing version of this new fighter under the NATF, or Naval Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, that started in 1988. In order to make the F-22 suitable for carrier duty, Lockheed Martin would have had to incorporate a number of very big changes to the F-22's design. Alongside the usual changes that one can expect out of carrier aircraft, like a strengthened fuselage and an added tailhook, a naval variant of the Raptor would have incorporated variable sweep wings similar to those employed by the Navy's existing, at the time, F-14 Tomcats. This addition, maybe more than any of the others, would have been a huge challenge for Lockheed's engineers to deal with. Sweep wings were expensive to maintain to begin with, but incorporating a sweep wing design into a stealth aircraft may have been nearly impossible without sacrificing a pretty significant degree of that low observability. And all told, it just didn't prove worth it to stick the Raptor on America's flat tops. Up next is another carrier fighter, one you may not have heard of, the A-12 Avenger II. On 13 January 1988, a joint team from McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics was awarded a development contract for what would become the A-12 Avenger II, not to be confused with Lockheed's A-12 from the 1960s, which was an SR-71 sibling. Once completed, the Navy's A-12 would have been a flying wing design sort of reminiscent of Northrop Grumman's B-2 Spirit, which was in development at the time, or even the new B-21 Raider, but it would have been quite a bit smaller, and its overall shape did differ a bit from the B-2 because it had much sharper corners. That sharp triangular shape of the A-12 eventually earned it the nickname, the Flying Dorito. And for some time, it seemed as though the A-12 Avenger II program was going off without a hitch, but then, seemingly without warning, it was suddenly canceled by Defense Secretary and future Vice President Dick Cheney in January of 1991, and it was later revealed that the A-12 Avenger II was significantly overweight, over budget, and behind schedule, making its cancellation pretty logical. Up next is the YF-12. Now, the SR-71 Blackbird may be among the most iconic airframes of the Cold War, or maybe of all aviation history, but this incredibly fast design was not always intended to serve only as a high-flying set of eyes. In fact, a variant of the SR-71's predecessor program, the faster and even higher-flying A-12, actually had a fighter interceptor sibling in the form of the YF-12, and eventually, in theory at least, the F-12B, as it would have been known in service. Now, the biggest changes the YF-12 saw when compared to its A-12 sibling were in the front of the aircraft, where a second cockpit was added for a fire control officer tasked with managing the interceptor's air-to-air arsenal. The nose was also modified to accommodate the Hughes AN/ASG-18 fire control radar that was developed for use in the defunct XF-108 program. But the most important change between the A-12 and the YF-12 came in the four bays, designed originally to house powerful cameras, film, and other reconnaissance equipment. Now, one of those four bays was converted to house fire control equipment, while the others were modified to house an internal payload of 3 Hughes AIM-47 Falcon air-to-air missiles. And while this program did not go into service, Lockheed did have a lot of success testing those missiles from this aircraft, and those missiles would go on to become the basis for the AIM-54 Phoenix, later carried by the F-14. And while we're talking about the F-14, up next is the ASF-14. While the F-14D took on the title Super Tomcat, the effort to modernize the F-14 began under the moniker ST-21, which, appropriately enough, stood for Super Tomcat for the 21st century. And make no mistake, that is exactly what this could have been, with improved avionics, more power, more range, and more capability pretty much across the board. But while both the ST-21 and AST-21 were billed as remanufacture programs for existing Tomcats, along with some new build aircraft, Grumman's pitch to the Navy eventually included an entirely new build Tomcat, dubbed the ASF-14. Now, the ASF-14 would have looked like its F-14 predecessors, but those similarities would have been largely skin deep. This new jet, with some 60,000 pounds of thrust, a better thrust-to-weight ratio than the F-14D, thrust vector control, massive internal fuel stores, huge payload capabilities, and incredible situational awareness provided by powerful onboard radar and a multitude of new sensor pods, could have been a fourth-generation fighter with few or maybe no peers to this very day, with the exception, maybe, of the F-15EX. It really could have been an incredible jet, it just also would have been very expensive. Up next is the F-15 Active. In 1984, the Flight Dynamics Laboratory out of the Air Force Aeronautical Systems Division awarded a contract to McDonnell Douglas to begin development on an F-15 concept that would allow these highly capable fighters to take off and land on short or damaged runways, originally dubbed the F-15 STOL MTD. In order to accomplish that goal, they incorporated front canards, which were actually the rear tail sections from an F-A-18 Hornet, and thrust vector control, or the ability to orient the engine's thrust somewhat independent of the aircraft itself. In 1993, the Air Force handed the keys to their F-15 STOL MTD to NASA for the purposes of their new ACTIVE program, which was short for Advanced Control Technology for Integrated Vehicles. Building off of their previous digital flight control programs like HIDEC and Performance Seeking Control, or PSC, NASA opted to retain that unusual wing layout for their new F-15 in this active program, hoping to use the fighter as a testbed for a whole swath of systems that could come to find use in the next generation of fighters. The F-15 Active ultimately proved to be significantly more capable than even the F-15 Eagle, but was never actually considered for production. Up next is the 747 CMCA. Now, during the Cold War, Boeing developed plans to load their 747 with as many as 72 air-launched AGM-86 cruise missiles to serve as a long-range arsenal plane capable of wiping out targets from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The design, dubbed the 747 Cruise Missile Carrier Aircraft, or CMCA, could have been an extremely cost-effective alternative to America's current fleets of heavy payload bombers in a wide variety of mission sets. Ultimately, the 747 CMCA never made it off the drawing board, with the Reagan administration pulling the B-1 program out of mothballs instead, and the B-2 entering service shortly thereafter. But it may be time that the US revisited the idea of leveraging these or similarly capable commercial airframes for more than just ferrying fuel, cargo, and passengers. At least, if you ask me. Okay, we're only about halfway through this list of aircraft, so I think I'm gonna have to call it there and make this a two-parter. So make sure to come back next week when we'll delve even deeper into the darkest recesses of this iceberg and talk about some of the craziest and least well-known aircraft programs ever to draw funds from Pentagon coffers. And let me know what you think of this iceberg approach to content, because Lord knows I could make similar lists about weapon systems, land systems, and just about anything else. But in the meantime, that'll do it for this week's edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.